What's up, guys? Unfortunately, I was a day late to see John Wick Chapter 4. Watching Michigan State play in the Sweet 16 sort of had to take priority over this, but I've now seen it, and I definitely have some thoughts on this movie. Before I do that, though, I do want to throw out an RIP to Lance Reddick. He will be sorely missed. Glad we got to see him in these John Wick movies. Now let's get into my thoughts on Chapter 4. And I guess the franchise as a whole, because John Wick for me has been an incredibly consistent franchise. I enjoyed the first one, and I think I actually enjoy all of the sequels even more than the original. It's definitely one of those franchises that is more so just fun, nonsensical escapism more than genuine substance. Like, the movies are style over substance for sure. But, I mean, you've got some of the best choreographed action sequences I've ever seen in these John Wick movies, so I've always been a fan. They sort of do for gunfights, knife fights, and swords what the Fast and Furious movies do for cars, but with more passion and genuine craft. I'm worried that's going to come off as an insult. Don't worry. I'm not trying to compare these to the Fast and Furious movies in terms of quality, but more so in what they do for the subgenre and the fact that I acknowledge that they're ridiculous, and that's sort of part of the fun. Obviously, there's a lot of nonsensical action sequences in these movies, but you just gotta kind of suspend your disbelief and enjoy them for what they are. I don't think Keanu Reeves is a great actor, but there's just something really charming about him and his line delivery in these films. Yes, it comes off as very cheesy. I think some of that has to be intentional. There's just no other way, but this is probably my favorite role that he's ever done. And the fact that he's almost 60 now and is still making these things is really impressive. So in John Wick Chapter 4, John is back at it again, trying to take down the High Table after his sort of betrayal and defeat at the end of Chapter 3. Bill Skarsgård is sort of the new big bad, so he's sort of the end final boss that he has to make his way to. But of course, there are a lot of secondary antagonists that John Wick has to fight to get to there. The most memorable of them is definitely Donnie Yen as Kane. This dude was just awesome. Again, I have no idea how a blind man could even compete with someone like John Wick, but who cares? It's so much fun to watch him on screen. He was absolutely badass. I love swords and I love katanas. If anything, that's what I wanted more of from this movie, and it does deliver a lot of that. I think my biggest concern going into this movie is that it's almost 3 hours long, which is like an hour longer than any of the other John Wick movies. And because these films are more so style over substance, I was concerned about how they're going to make the runtime feel natural, not have the film drag on, and not have it feel repetitive. And we'll get into the repetitiveness when we get into my issues, but as far as feeling the runtime, I actually really didn't feel too much at all. This is a very tightly paced film for being nearly 3 hours. The action sequences are plentiful, they're long, and I think that some of them in this movie are among the best that I have seen in the 21st century in terms of filmmaking. I can't think of action sequences that are better choreographed than what this franchise has brought to the table, and I think this one might have some of the best of the franchise. And yes, the stunt work and the choreography obviously is front and center and is probably the most praised. But even the cinematography, there are a couple things that they do during a certain fight scene in the third act. I don't even really want to specify what it is because I just didn't expect it. And when they did it, I was like, wow, like there was some genuine passion put into this thing. And I did not expect them to try some new camera angles and things like that. Again, the entire cast is really good. There's also a dog in the movie. The dog is an absolute scene stealer. I gotta say, going into this movie, I didn't think they could really top what came before, but I think they have topped what came before with some of the action scenes in this movie. It's also very colorful. There's a lot of neon lights in the background and just shit going on left and right. You've got so much going on in a single frame when you're looking at some of the action sequences. And probably the best praise I can give this movie is that as it goes along, I think it only gets better and better. It's one of those films that really ramps up in tension and in stakes as it goes along. I think the climax might be the best part because you get to a certain point in the movie where Bill Skarsgård and Keanu Reeves sit down and they have a conversation and they decide on going into a sort of single combat. And having that end game in mind sort of helps ramp up the tension and ramp up sort of the suspense of what's going to happen at the end, which I think some of the other sequels might have lacked a little bit. Now, despite the fact that I had an absolute blast with John Wick Chapter 4, it's not a flawless film. I do think it is by far the best of the series, but there are a couple of flaws and I want to point those out. The first of which is probably that, yes, it could have been a little bit shorter, and not even the fact that there's downtime that could have been trimmed out. I think there's actually a lot that they do that's sort of important to developing the John Wick character that the other sequels haven't done. I almost feel like Chapter 4 could have decreased the length of the action sequences. There are a couple that run on a little bit longer than they need to. And it's not that they're bad or anything, it just gets a little bit repetitive in the way that people are killed. It's oftentimes, you get a couple of punches and swings in there, and then it's a boom headshot, move on to the next guy. And it gets to the point where it's kind of difficult to fathom why anyone would go against John Wick single-handedly and try and kill him. especially given his body count by the end of this movie. Like, holy shit, some of these people are just really inept. As great as the choreography is in this movie, if you really wanted to slow things down and pause things, I'm sure you could nitpick and point out sort of just a lot of red shirts being red shirts. They're there to be killed, they're there to be bad at their job and get massacred by John Wick, and it does get a little bit repetitive at certain points. Also, as I said, I think the film gets a lot better as it goes on. The beginning was a little rocky for me. I just didn't really know what direction the movie was going to go in until Bill Skarsgård comes on screen and sort of gives his villainous monologue, which, by the way, that's another nitpick that I have, is that he's one of those characters that really likes to talk in riddles a lot. Becomes a little bit tiresome. But as a whole, this movie delivers on spectacle in ways that I can't think of any other movie that has in the last couple of years, except for maybe Top Gun Maverick, maybe some of the last two Avengers movies. Other than that, though, this thing was spectacular. I had so much fun watching John Wick Chapter 4, and I think if you're a fan of the previous three, there's no reason you won't have an absolute blast with this. So John Wick Chapter 4, it gets a 4.5 out of 5 from me. It's definitely not flawless, but it's an absolute blast at the cinema. If you're looking for something to sort of get you back in the mood for big, thrilling spectacle, this is absolutely the closest you can get to that in 2023. As always, guys, if you have seen the movie, I do want to hear what you think about it down in the comments. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you have time, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for checking this out.